At some point in the mid-90s, a door was opened to me, and I walked through that door, and I have genuinely never looked back since. Hello everybody, and welcome back for episode 9 of Graham's Haunted Life. As you can see, the title of this episode is The Door Was Flung Open, and originally when I was planning this episode, that was in reference to a story I'm going to tell in a little while. But as of yesterday, it also has a bit of another meaning because me and my wife decided to watch The Shining yesterday, and it's been a long time since we've watched that film. And we both had the same experience where we saw The Shining when we were young, long before we ever read the book. And then when we did each read the book, we both found that it blew our minds how much better than the film the book was. And of course, that is generally the case. The book tends to be better than the film. But in the last few days, I've been rereading Dreamcatcher by Stephen King. And because of yesterday watching The Shining, it's made me think, once I finish Dreamcatcher, I'm going to reread The Shining. Because The Shining was a book that had a massive impact on me when I read it. But if I go back before I read that book, as I said, the door was flung open, is the title of the video. During the sort of 90s, the early to mid 90s, that was my kind of childhood. And it seemed like here in the UK at that time, there was a lot of children's TV that leaned towards the horror side of things and a lot of children's fiction as well. So I would say that people like R.L. Stine stood in front of that door and opened it. And I walked through that door, and waiting on the other side was a man called Stephen King. So we get into the second half of the 90s, and I used to regularly go to what we would call car boot sales in the UK. Other places around the world may call them flea markets or something like that, but we would call them car boot sales. I would regularly go to these things, and I would keep my eye open for Stephen King novels that people were selling secondhand. And I have a lot of the sort of 1980s mass print paperback King novels with the black sort of cover with the colourful piece of artwork that goes along with the title. I've got a load of those. I started picking them up towards the second half of the 90s. And I read, when I was probably about 10, I read Pet Sematary and really loved it. A little bit later, I read Salem's Lot. Now, again, I had seen the 2-part TV movie of Salem's Lot before I read the book. And I found, again, the book was amazing. I really enjoyed the book, and it had some parts in it that were genuinely creepy for I must have been early teens when I read that book. Now, I've read a few Stephen King books. I had the same experience with Dreamcatcher. The movie that came out in 2003, I remember staying up on a school holiday to watch that as it was shown on TV for the first time. And then getting a copy of the book, which came out, I think, 2 or 3 years earlier. And the book is far, far better than the film, even though I really enjoy the film of Dreamcatcher. But none of Stephen King's books that I've read have had such an effect on me like The Shining did. There are parts in The Shining that I find so comforting, and other parts in The Shining that I find so terrifying. The part where Danny sees in the book, it's Danny that sees the odd characters in that room, one of them dressed up as a dog, doing things that a kid shouldn't see. And in the movie, it was his mother who saw it. But I remember in the book reading that and thinking, Jesus, what the hell am I reading here? Like, I'm not going to repeat what that character says to Danny, And you've obviously got the infamous Room 237 scene in the movie, which in the book I believe is 217. In the book, the descriptive sort of aspect of it is far more sort of effective than what you actually see in the film with Jack Nicholson. Stephen King is a master of description, but it's something I criticise him for and praise him for in equal measure, because in some of his books that I've read, the man can take 7 pages to describe the surface of a spoon, and it's just sometimes a bit too much. But when he's using that descriptive power that he has to tell you about an element of the story that is essential, it's so great. He's so great at that. There's a part in The Shining where Jack Torrance is down in the basement of the hotel and he's looking through old newspaper clippings by a dim little light, and he's reading about the history of the hotel and some of the horrible things that have gone on, and seeing pictures in these newspaper clippings, and he's starting to hear noises in the darkness around him. Now, that would absolutely horrify me if I were down in a dark basement of a big old hotel that has a reputation for being haunted, and I started to hear noises all around me. That would absolutely terrify me. Now, this beginning part of this episode here, talking about Stephen King, it wasn't planned, so I'm probably rambling a little bit. It's just that we watched The Shining last night, and I wanted to sort of have a little bit of a talk about his books and the effects they've had on me, but more specifically The Shining. And I'm definitely going to reread it. At the moment, I'm massively enjoying rereading Dreamcatcher. That one is brilliant for capturing the connection you have with your friends when you're young, and you've always got those couple of friends that go all the way through life with you. I've got a couple of those, and Stephen King is a master of capturing how friends interact, capturing the casual swearing and the crudeness that, the crudities of your behaviour when you're a young kid hanging around with your friends. He is just a master of that. Other books I've read by him where like the simplest of descriptive detail is just so sumptuous to me. So in the book It, there's a part where one of the characters is preparing to leave home. She's gotten the call. Bev has gotten the call to go back to Derry, and her husband is an abusive guy, and he's really awful to her in that scene. But there's a part where you get a little bit of the thoughts that are running through his head, and he's woken up in the sort of middle of the night to her packing her bags, and he's getting like sort of angry, and he's ruminating in his head what he's gonna do and what he's gonna say to her. But he's also got the startings of a hangover because he was drinking quite heavily the night before. And he describes, sort of in his own thoughts, how nice it would be to just go and pour a little bit of Jim Beam over a single ice cube to keep that hangover at bay, and decides not to do it for some reason or other. But just that little sort of bit of description. I mean, on a really hot night, when I'm like chewed up with the heat, I will just get an ice cube and pour a little bit of whiskey over it, and it's so refreshing. And that little bit of description in that book really, really sort of gets me. It just really works for me. So yeah, I've rambled on there about Stephen King for a few minutes, and it wasn't planned. We've just decided that we're going to go on a bit of a binge of watching Stephen King adaptations, and I'm going to read a couple of the books that I've already read in the past. But it's been so long since I've read any of his books. Like The Shining, it must be 21 or 22 years since I read that book. I'm 38 now. You know, Dreamcatcher must have been, I'm imagining I was about 15 when I read that book. Yeah, around the same time as I read The Shining. But yeah, massively enjoying Stephen King again at the moment. And he was just such a massive sort of gateway into the world of horror for me at a young age. Now I'll get into what the episode was originally planned for. In front of me on the screen of my tablet, I've got a few little snippets of local folklore and ghost stories, local to me in County Durham, and I'm just going to pick them out at random and have a little talk about them. And then when I've gone through those things, I've got a couple of little stories of things that happened to me years ago that were quite creepy. So we'll jump into a couple of these now. I'll just pick them out at random. So this one's called The Elusive Hare, and it took place in Easington. Easington is a little colliery place on the coast of County Durham where my grandparents lived, where my mother is from. And this is a sort of little piece of local folklore. A hare, which avoided hunters for many years, was finally bitten on a hind leg by a hound. The creature was seen to dart into a nearby cottage, and when the huntsmen entered, they discovered an old lady with a bloodied leg. Now I remember when I first found this little piece of, information online, and I spoke to my mother about it, and she said, "Oh yeah, she's known of that story for a long time." And there was at one point a cafe in Easington Village, and the name of the cafe was a reference to this tale. And until I found this, I knew nothing about it, and I think that's really cool. I love a little piece of local folklore like that. Now this one's quite creepy. The title is Red-Eyed Figure, and it takes place in Cold Heselden, which is not very far from Easington Village, and it's a place I've been to many, many times. So the lane leading away from the Pemberton Arms pub, that's a road I've been on many times. There's a bus stop along the road that I've used. I've been to the pub, which is no longer there. So this story was from the 10th of October 2009. So a couple walking along the dark lane encountered a 7-foot tall, dark, man-shaped figure with glowing red eyes. The couple watched it for around 15 seconds before it screamed loudly and then dropped to the floor and just disappeared out of view. Now, as I said, this is a place I've been many times in my life. And to think that two people saw something like that along there is quite creepy. I've never seen anything like that along there. And I will say, these two people had clearly been to the pub and had maybe had a skinful of alcohol. So it's possible they didn't see exactly where it is they think they saw. But it's also possible that they did see something genuinely terrifying. And I thought that was a cool little story. So another sort of story involving a shadowy figure takes place in Shotton Colliery, which is the village next to where I grew up, and it's the village where I went to primary school. This takes place in a private residence, which was a new build. And when you think of new builds, you don't tend to think of ghost stories. But it says that a former occupier of this property moved out after his dog chased a shadow out of the living room and up the stairs. They also reported hearing horses' hooves and experiencing poltergeist-like behaviour. Now, in Shotton Colliery, horses are very popular. There are a lot of sort of travellers in the area, but there are a lot of places where people just sort of own horses and they keep them. And I'm not exactly sure where the new build is in this story. I do know where all of the new build estates are in Shotton. And I do know that near them there are places where horses are kept. So if you're hearing horses' hooves That may not have been a ghostly rider or a ghostly carriage. It may just be that there are horses nearby. But your mind is going to play up all of these things when you have witnessed your dog chasing a shadowy figure out of the living room and up the stairs. And apparently the family moved out because of it. Quite creepy, and the fact that it's so close to where I grew up is great. Another one from Shotton Colliery, entitled Glowing-Eyed Shadow. A miner with the surname of Lamb and his family moved into this cottage, only to be faced with something that rattled and shook the front door every night. A practical joker was first thought to be to blame, but after a night of snow, the door was opened and no footsteps could be seen. Lamb's son spotted a shadowy figure outside of the cottage one night, which reportedly had glowing red eyes, remarkably similar to the figure in the story that took place at Cold Heselden. And Shotton Colliery and Cold Heselden aren't that far apart. Pretty cool. Now, presents. This one took place in a village called Horden, which is right near Easington. On the coast, coal mining village. This story comes from 1994. After a failed exorcism, a family fled this property in 1967. Though they were reluctant to explain what they had encountered, more recently another family moved out after enduring cold spots and feeling a depression which enveloped the house. It's pretty cool. I do know of a few sort of ghost stories from the Horden area, and I think they are all interpreted or retellings that have been embellished of this same story of a house that had an exorcism done on it. But you get kids who will say, oh yeah, it was the house next door to me, and you'll get another kid say, oh, it was the house down the road from my grandma or whatever. But I think this story has just become a bit of sort of legend, the house in Horden that had an exorcism. Yeah. So Lanchester Peth Bank, that is really, really close to where I live now. And this story is quite cool. A phantom woman reputedly stands on the spot of an accident involving a horse and coach during the early 19th century. Sometimes the ghostly coach and the horse also make an appearance. I've driven down that bank many times and never seen anything like that. Driven there during the day, during the night, never seen anything like that. But it's a cool story. Maybe I should look into whether there actually was an accident involving a horse and cart and whether anybody died. I will have a look into that. Now this one's another story from Lanchester, the same little village that's right along the road from where we live now. The Wilson family and the Dent family, who both lived along the same street, exchanged properties after the Dents twice fled their family home due to a haunting. Exorcisms performed by local vicars were claimed to have failed. A member of the Wilson family said they needed a bigger home and that they did not believe in ghosts. I mean, I wouldn't, just because my house was haunted, I wouldn't just swap and move into a smaller home. I would sell the house and go elsewhere. But hey, whatever kind of floats your boat, I suppose. So here's an interesting one. This one's entitled Vanishing Lady, and it took place in Durham on Newton Hall Estate, which is a very big housing estate. And it's the housing estate where my wife's parents and their son, her brother, still live. And it says, observing the silhouette of a woman walking down the street, a witness watched as the figure promptly disappeared after passing under a street lamp. Realising there was nowhere the figure could have gone, the perplexed witness searched the area without success. Couldn't find anybody. Now, as I said, Laura's parents and her brother still live on Newton Hall. And I do remember her brother said that the only sort of thing he's ever had happen to him that was odd was this one time he was walking from their house in Newton Hall to the place where he works, and he saw a person up ahead, wasn't paying too much attention to the person, and they seemingly just disappeared, and he couldn't work out where they had gone. Now, of course, He's a very rational person, and so am I. And you know, of course, he just saw a person and didn't notice the point at which that person wandered off down another walkway or whatever. And that's the way he thinks of it too. He just explained that at the time it was a bit like, where could that person have gone? You know, just for a few seconds it was a bit perplexing to him, but quite an interesting story. So I have a story here that took place in a village called Thornley, and it took place in Thornley Workmen's Club. And Thornley is again another place that is right near the village where I grew up, and I went to school with a lot of kids from Thornley. So this story says a person working in the upper part of the building reported seeing a cloudy figure which emerged from a dressing room only to vanish right near the witness. The witness was told by staff that the ghost was nicknamed Salty and it likes to make its presence known. Most pubs and clubs have a ghost story. I've never been in Thornley Workmen's Club, but I do know the building from the outside looks like it would house a few ghost stories. It's a big old red brick building. And this next story is from Thornley as well, and it comes from a council house, an unnamed council house. A family living in this newly constructed house encountered a black shape dozens of times, often accompanied by a horrible presence. The family eventually informed the local vicar, who prayed in the house, and the haunting ceased. I mean, that's your classic sort of, ghost story. You've gone to the local vicar and gotten rid of it. Those kind of stories are 10 a penny. Now, yesterday we went for a little day out in Tynemouth, and today I found this little story from Tynemouth, so I've added it in. It says the location, Tynemouth, coastline of Cullercoats. So, though a good description of the creature is lacking, fishermen from this area chased and killed a sea monster, the body of which was brought back to land. The carcass was taken into a shop along Grey Street, and entry was charged at several shillings per view. Now, I don't believe in sea monsters, but this story comes from 1849, and around that time, your average fisherman from the northeast coast doesn't probably have a very detailed knowledge of all the creatures that are out there in the North Sea or in the oceans around the world in general. Science didn't have a full picture of it. We still to this day discover new things, and it is likely that, this is the way I'm thinking of it, it's likely they've pulled like some kind of giant squid out of the water, and been absolutely perplexed at what it might be. That's my guess. Something along those lines. That's my guess. Now, here's a little thing about Mary Ann Cotton, who is a famous female serial killer from County Durham. But I've never heard this little story. A bench in West Auckland, which I believe West Auckland is where she was originally from. But there's a bench nicknamed Mary's Seat. A local myth says that the bench is located where 20 Johnson Terrace once stood, the home of serial killer Mary Ann Cotton, and the site where she poisoned 3 people. It is reported that at times the bench is surrounded by a coldness, although the skeptical would say this is due to the open village green by which the bench stands. Well, yeah, it's cold outside sometimes. Like, I can't really say too much about that. It's a bench outside. It would be cool if that genuinely is the spot where Mary Ann Cotton's house stood, where she poisoned her first few victims. In a later episode, I'll talk a lot more about Mary Ann Cotton. It's quite an interesting story. So this here is just basically just a sentence, and it's quite a horrible thing that is very believable. It's entitled Chained Child, and it comes from Redworth Hall. Lord Surtees had a mentally ill child chained to the fireplace, and the cries of a youngster can be heard in the hall to this day. it is highly likely that a family of repute back in, you know, older times would have seen a family member who was severely mentally ill as an embarrassment and probably chained up to a fireplace in some room off in a far corner of the house and kind of ignored. I mean, that we know fine well that that happened a lot. Families, if they had a child that had learning difficulties or whatever it may be, they tended to just ship them off to an asylum once upon a time. And when you look now, the issue was probably autism. People probably had severe autism, and they were just sort of deemed insane lunatics and locked away. It's horrible. So this story relates to a building in Sunderland, in Ryop, that is no longer there. Cherry Knoll Hospital. Now, when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager, the legend that went around about this building and how haunted it was like it was massive. Everybody wanted to go and break into Cherry Knoll and have a look around and see if they could see a ghost. It was this massive old Victorian asylum that during sort of my late teens in the sort of early 2000s, no, second half of the early 2000s, 2008, 9ish, it was abandoned. It was due to be demolished, and everybody used to go and break in. This one particular night, me and my friends drove up there, and we were just about to go through a gap in the fence, and a torchlight panned around onto us, and a voice said, "Not tonight, lads." And a security guard had rumbled us before we'd even gotten through the fence. But this here claims that there was no ghostly activity in Cherry Knoll Hospital. So, from 2008, ghost hunters were said to be putting their lives at risk by breaking into this former hospital. And a local newspaper, the Sunderland Echo, named it the most haunted hospital in the UK. Unfortunately, there is a distinct lack of historic ghost stories relating to the structure, and one cannot help but think it's a modern myth in the making. And that's a bit of a weird one. It's like it's renowned for being this haunted hospital, but there's a distinct lack of historic ghost stories relating to the structure. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any ghost stories relating to the structure. I imagine staff from that place when it was open had all sorts of stories about the place. I imagine people who broke in encountered all sorts of strange activity, whether that was paranormal or not. There definitely are ghost stories about that building that used to stand there. 100%. To look at, it was one of the creepiest buildings that I've ever seen in my life. So earlier I mentioned that the title of this video, "The Door Was Flung Open," related to a story I was going to tell. So if we go back about 10 years, my dad and his partner, they used to have this big Newfoundland dog. And when they would go away on holiday, I would stay at their house and look after the dog. And I always know, I've always known that there were ghost stories related to that house. Apparently, a police officer refused to enter the house one day, so left his colleague to enter the house, and they wanted to talk to all of the people in the street about something that had gone on. This police officer wouldn't enter the house, and his reason was when he was a young kid, his grandfather had chased him around the living room of the house, whipping him with a belt, but his grandfather had been dead for a few months. So yeah, I've always known that story about that particular house, and I have always found the house to be a little bit creepy. And during those times when I would stay there to take care of the dog whilst they were away, a couple of things did happen. There was one night where I'd gone up to bed but I was just lying there reading, and I heard this really, really loud, like, thumping, as if it was coming from inside the house. It didn't sound like it was in the house next door. It didn't sound like it was outside. It just sounded like it was in the house. And if you've ever seen the original black and white film, The Haunting, it was kind of like that. It was just really, really loud and aggressive. Bang, bang, bang. And it like made me sit up. I dropped my book and went down the stairs to have a look around, see if anybody was breaking in. The dog was just lying in the kitchen peacefully. Seemingly he didn't hear it at all and didn't bother him, where normally he would bark if he heard anything. There was, nothing upstairs seemed to have fallen over, nothing downstairs seemed to have fallen over, but I just heard this bang, 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 and it really, really startled me. And that was sort of like one of the first things that had happened to me whilst I was staying in that house on my own, that had made me sort of think, ooh, I'm not too sure about staying here alone, actually. But I did many, many other times. I looked after the dog. There was one time I was sat in the living room one night. The dog was just sat in the kitchen doorway, and I had the TV on. And I heard what sounded like footsteps run down the stairs. Now, the staircase would just be on the other side of the wall to the living room. And then the door at the bottom of the staircase that leads into the living room just swung open. It flung open and hit the arm of the couch. And nobody was there. That one really, really terrified me. Really terrified me. And of course, that's the story that the title relates to. The door was flung open. It really, really aggressively just opened and hit the side of the couch. But I know that the door was shut properly and latched. Like, I know that the handle had to have been moved, and I heard the click of the handle go down and back up, and then the door slam into the arm of the couch. I know that I heard that. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw the movement of the door, and I saw as it hit the couch. It hadn't been left ajar slightly, and it just slowly drifted open. It flew open, and it absolutely terrified me. Now, there was another night I'd made a cup of coffee, and there was a little sort of coffee table in the middle of the room, and I'd put it on a coaster, and I was watching the telly, and I didn't so much see this, but I heard it, and I knew what it was that must have happened. Now, I heard the sound as if my cup had been lifted a couple of sort of centimetres off the coaster and dropped again. And when I looked back at the cup, the coffee was, moving around in the cup as if it had been knocked. And it sounded to me like that cup had just been picked up just a little way and then dropped again. Absolutely terrifying. And another time I sat there and the kitchen door was open. And this is a weird one, and I'm not saying that any of this was ghosts. I'm just saying all of it was weird. I was sitting in the living room, the kitchen door was open, but the light was off in the kitchen. And I can kind of see that doorway out of the corner of my eye from where I'm sitting. And you know those times when you just feel like someone or something is there? I just had that kind of feeling, and I sort of thought, I'm pleased that this is the last night, and tomorrow I'm going back to my house. My dad and his partner, him and her, they'll be back home tomorrow, and I get to go home. It is quite a creepy house. Now, my dad's partner had never ever met his mum, because my dad's mum died when I was really young, when my mum and dad were still together. And so my dad, has been with his now fiance for coming up on 30 years now, but she never met me nana. And there were one night where they were in the living room watching TV together, and apparently she claims that she saw a woman standing in the corner of the room holding up 3 fingers. And when she explained to me dad what the woman looked like, my dad thought it sounded like what his mum looked like, but didn't understand why the woman would be holding up three fingers. And then, sort of not too long after that, my dad had been at his sort of parents' old house. His dad was still alive, and his sister had found three rings that had belonged to his mum, and had said, "Found these after years and years, and they're yours if you want to take them." So that was a weird thing that she'd seen, seen a woman holding three fingers up, described her to my dad. My dad thought it sounded like, a description of his mother. And then the next time he's at like his dad's house, his sister says, "I found these three rings that belong to mum, and you can have them if you want." That is a bit strange, you know. But yeah, their house does have a bit of a vibe. It was a genuinely creepy place. So there you go. You've got the story now that references the title. The door was flung open. So I've rambled on a little bit about Stephen King. I've talked a little bit about some local folklore and ghost tales. I've told a couple of scary stories that happened to me. Now let's talk about a bit of music. This week I'm not going to do an album of the week. I'm going to talk about a release that I put out a little while ago. It was the first time when I was recording my own music where I brought the guitar into play. Now, as you'll have heard on the ends of these episodes, I've occasionally put a little piece of my ambient music that I created with a synthesizer. This week I'm going to play one of the first really heavy, doomy metal droning tracks that I recorded. So I've got this little 2-track release out on my Bandcamp at the moment, and I'll put a link to it in the description. The title track is called Ritualistic Burial, and the second track is called Dead and Forgotten. And these two tracks, just at the beginning of this year, I decided I'm going to, in some way or other, I'm going to bring the guitar into the music I'm making. And I didn't really know what kind of influence I would bring in, but it turned out I went straight for playing doomy chords and really elongated, droning, doomy guitar sounds. And I came up with these 2 tracks. And I'm going to play the title track, Ritualistic Burial. It's probably not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but I know that a lot of the people who have been supporting this little podcast are of that world of heavy music anyway, so maybe you'll enjoy it. And if you do, maybe you'll click the Bandcamp link and take a download. You can download it for free. I mean, the option to pay for the tracks is there, or the option to pay for any of my music is there. But I don't expect people paying for it. You can download it for free. That's no problem. So, without further ado, let's play Ritualistic Burial by DARKLIFE. And I'll see you back here next Monday night.